And we do have some extra chairs leaning against these walls. It's impossible to see anything from here, but they should be there. So if you can't find a chair, you can grab one and you can, this is going to be collaborative on some level as we're combining the party and the panel. And so after the panel, we might also ask you to just move the chairs with us. It's a community effort. I'm really grateful to everyone. It's really good to see a lot of you here. Some people I know very well, some people I don't know, and I wanted to welcome all of you and to thank you. I'm Danielle Drori. I am Associate Faculty and Director of Development at Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. And we are about to start tonight's program. We're already live streaming. And while everyone and our panel speakers get ready, I'll just say a few words about our work and our enormous debt to our community, to all of you. We called this year's gathering Good Times in Dark Times because these are truly dark times. But we also want to have a good time. And our panelists will expand on what makes today's wars and assaults on people's lives and freedom, both within and without the US, particularly daunting, and also about the challenges that small nonprofits like Brooklyn Institute face. I just wanted to say a few words about all of you, our community of students and fellow readers and friends and supporters, and I wanted to thank all of you for making possible a space for thinking freely. Maybe some of you thought of Hannah Arendt's Men in Dark Times when seeing the invitation to this event. I already talked to a couple of you about Arendt, and I did not initiate the conversation, at least about that topic. And I did used to teach at a university, not the Brooklyn Institute, a part of Men in Dark Times, and I've been thinking about it in the past few days. We at BISR are not new to thinking that universities are often complicit with dominant forms of oppression, and this is one of the reasons we exist. And so it did strike me as ironic that I once taught part of Arendt's text at a private university because it was this part about Lessing, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, in which Arendt shows that for all the didactic spirit of Lessing's work, he really never aspired to tell anyone what to think and what to say. She says of Lessing that he did not shun publishing texts of many contradictions, that he did not abide by any imperative of non-contradiction or self-consistency, and then she quotes him as declaring, "I am not duty-bound to resolve the difficulties that I create in my writing. May my ideas always be somewhat disjunct or even appear to contradict one another, if only they are ideas in which readers will find material that stirs them to think for themselves." And this, Arendt remarks on this, he not only wanted no one to coerce him, but he also wanted to coerce no one. So it's in this spirit that we always gather at Brooklyn Institute in our courses, in our events, and that includes tonight's panel and party. And we're very grateful for all the ways in which you sustain us by showing up, by reading and conversing with us through membership dues. And we do have a membership table there. Lauren is there. So if you want to become a BISR member today, it's a great opportunity to become one. We have new totes, right, for members only. So that's there, the membership table. And I'll just thank, our tireless administrative team, and that includes Lauren Wolf, who's also associate faculty, our executive director, Ajay Singh Chaudhry, who's also a panelist tonight, our managing director, Mark DeLucas. A round of applause for Mark. Everyone, really, everyone. And then we have our AV technician, Ryan Lentini here, and Seth Rose, our program coordinator, who's there at the entrance and has worked really hard on this event. I also wanted to thank our fierce board, and we have, I can see one of you even through the blinding lights, Maggie Garrity, who also reads with us frequently, Michelle Miller, Alfred Lee. Where are you, Alfred? Who's also associate faculty with us. And really just thank you for all of you for being here. A special thank you to our members, those of you who are already members. And if you are not a member yet, do become a member. And then to some of our supporters and longtime advisors, Sarah Klugage, Juliet Moser, Sherry Hovsepian, Miriam Heyer, who couldn't make it tonight, and also Heather Althoff, who couldn't make it tonight. Maybe they're watching us through the live stream. And now to our panel.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and hello. Hopefully we won't cover too much the same ground. On behalf of Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, I'd like to welcome you all, students, alumni, friends, faculty, staff, board members, guests, both here in this room and watching from afar, to the 2025 Annual Institute Social. This is going well. Okay. This year's social is a bit different for reasons I think will become obvious, and is appropriately titled, as Danielle just mentioned, Good Times in Dark Times. And whether you're standing in front of me right now or watching at home, I do genuinely hope that you are having at least a modicum of a good time. And I'd like to recognize, just as Danielle did, a handful of the many people who made this daunting task possible in no particular order: my colleagues Nara, Michael, Mark, Lauren, Seth, Ryan, Danielle herself, as well as the extended BISR faculty, volunteers, all the good people at Littlefield. Please do tip your bartenders, and certainly not least, all of you. But, I should stop projecting, but there is no denying that we are living through extraordinarily dark times as well. And in a few minutes, my colleagues Raphael Khachaturian and Sophie Lewis will help us all try to make some sense of this time, bits and pieces, from mass death to moral panics, from climate catastrophe to crises of capitalism, and quite a lot in between and beyond. But before we do that, I want to briefly address BISR as an institution and as a community in this moment. Over the past 13 years, so many of us have looked to discussions like these, opportunities for critical education and research, whether the topics at hand are speculative explorations of music and art, or deep dives into the arcane points of philosophy, political economy, and mathematics, or indeed serious and non-salacious analyses of political crises like this, or even, and not trying to put too much pressure on the three of us, trying to get a grasp on it all. And just as so many of us, faculty, students, alumni, friends alike, have come to rely upon BISR courses and events, projects and programs, and conversations like these, BISR depends on all of you, everyone in this room and everyone watching at home. Your classroom contributions, your insights, your questions, your suggestions, which push and inspire faculty, students, and the broader community alike. This is what teaching should be. And, it's not exactly radical pedagogy theory, but it's true. This way it should be everywhere. Together, we have all built a new home for critical education research in the 21st century, even as the edifice of elite higher education crumbles under the weight of its own institutional decay, political pressure, and intellectual and political stagnation. About more anon. When BISR started 13 years ago, it was a class, a bar, and some fairly lofty, practically quixotic ideals. Today, with your help, some 4,000 students a year are learning in BISR classrooms, tens of thousands more are coming in digital and in-person events, listening, watching, and reading BISR podcasts, videos, and teach-ins. And there are new BISR satellites growing, new courses, projects, programs being developed as fast and as far as funding allows. Sorry. Trying to meet the hopes of everyone here and everyone listening right now, and trying to reach the many more, I can't stress this enough, who clamor for what this new home provides. And just as tonight we balance celebrating together as a community without turning away from harsh realities, I must say that all this is happening at a time which is quite possibly the starkest in BISR's history. BISR faculty already face repression on everything from immigration status to their political views. BISR institutionally is under threat from various government initiatives to assault civil society here in the United States. and from economic crises which shave away at our comically thin margins. Our support for dissident scholars from Palestine, Ukraine, and Russia have also put a giant target on our back. We're not recipients of massive foundation support. Believe it or not, pitching this institution is a bit hard. So we count on individual donors of any size to usher us through these tough times. Pay for unexpected crisis costs. Hello, our newly found need for teams of lawyers and digital security, to offer our pay what you can scholarships in every course and provide more of everything that we do. And provide more classes, programs, events, media, cities, countries, etc., with this critical and accessible, rigorous scholarship everywhere it's desired and needed to spread and grow this institution, which teaches classics and the cutting edge, poetry and philosophy, music and mathematics, art and Arabic, and just about everything in between and every form of theory under the sun, all designed with, from, and for the needs and lives of working adults. So it is here that I must absolutely fulfill my official administrative mandate and ask that everyone listening consider becoming a BISR member. Tonight only, there are extra perks at all membership levels. If you're here, we have special NUTOs, as Danielle mentioned, and whether here or afar, all membership levels tonight will receive an additional 10% course coupon. Toggling from talking about like fascism to funding may give us all, myself included, a bit of a mental whiplash. But this is indeed part of walking this conjunctural tightrope. We are, after all, are named after the original Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany, although not all of us are critical theory scholars. As Mackenzie Wark once joked, Horkheimer's deft handling of their funds might be as important as his contributions to social thought. It's a really good line. You should read it. It's funny as hell. But I did not think that institutional name would resonate in 2025 for a far more direct reason. Adorno famously argued, this is going to get super dark, sorry, that Adorno famously argued that fascism has imposed a new categorical imperative on the world. Act in such a way that Auschwitz can never happen. It would be a betrayal of us all if I sugarcoated the fact, when I know we will discuss tonight, that a genocide in Palestine is proceeding before our very eyes. And this is hardly the only annihilationist impulse we see increasingly embraced by the powers that be. Migrants, trans people, social and political undesirables, denied their rights to live in some cases, thrown up on those same screens we scroll for psychotic sport and spectacle and others, whisked away under prerogatives dictated only by political whim and discourse. Just here in New York City, our mayoral frontrunner, Andrew Cuomo, of course, is, like, just 4 years ago, we all knew, like, this man killed basically thousands of old people, like, on purpose. Like, he was like, yeah, who's going to care about that? He is a serial sex offender. But no, we've decided that doesn't really matter. So this kind of acceptance of depredation, death, and annihilation has become part of the air we breathe. Do we know how to end this? I mean, us? I'm going to hopefully not step on anyone's toes by saying no. I will never lie and say, there's this one neat trick which will solve everything. Some people do that. I think it's pretty stupid. But it is the mission of a real educational institution not to sweep such realities under the rug, but to address them in all their horror at the very least. Even if the power to implement difficult solutions is not ready to hand, at least we can try to understand them. And now I want to turn to my colleagues to do just that. So these are not political designations. To my left is Raphael Khachaturian. Put me in the center, that's awkward. To my left is Raphael Khachaturian, who's our associate faculty member who teaches social and political science, social and political theory. And to my right is Sophie Lewis, also associate faculty member here at Brooklyn Institute, teaching a range of courses in feminist theory, Marxist theory, and, oh God, I forgot the third category I was going to use. Well, yeah, a wide range of courses. Um, and Raf, do you feel comfortable sort of taking the first stab at what the fuck?
You have his mic.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Ajay. A nice small question to get the night started. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this good? All right. I just want to kind of begin by echoing what Ajay has said and saying that it is so amazing to, in the midst of these dark times, to have a space like BISR where people can come together and talk about really what I think are really cool, interesting texts and thinkers and ideas. And those kinds of spaces are few and far in between for a number of reasons that we'll talk about today. So, so that's just kind of, that's to say that BISR is great, and I love it here. So I want to, I guess, begin by talking just a little bit about history, although the basis of my presentation or my conversation is not going to be about history. But as the late Frederick Jameson said, history is what hurts, and sometimes we need to go through that in order to figure out how we got to where we are. My parents were born in the city of Tbilisi in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1949, 1950. At that time, another Georgian by the name of Jugashvili, who you might have heard of, ruled the largest country in the world, largest territorial country in the world. The world was mired in a kind of Cold War conflict between democracy and totalitarianism, good and evil. The threat of nuclear exterminationism loomed both over, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. By the time my parents were about 39, 40 years old, it was 1988, 89. They began, and what happened is that they began to see cynical, corrupt elites basically start to dismantle the country that they had grown up in all of their lives and pretty much was everything that they knew. Everything, as the saying goes, everything was forever until it was no more. I turned 39 this year, and looking around me, I see cynical, corrupt elites dismantling a country, the country that we live in now. In a way, it's deja vu. It's led some of my friends to even joke that, what's the kind of common variable here? And that's just me. I'm just kind of bringing down one global superpower after another, no matter where I live. But of course, 1989 was also the year in which Francis Fukuyama published his famous/infamous essay, The End of History and the Last Man. Fukuyama, writing at a time of sort of at the end of the Cold War, the kind of unraveling of the socialist bloc, essentially posited that competing ideologies of liberalism had been vanquished, right? So fascism was defeated in what was the most kind of violent, bloody conflict known to humankind to date. And the other kind of big competitor, communism, essentially petered out under the weight of its own contradictions. All that was left, in other words, were the kind of mundane comforts of liberal democracy and the market. So those two things kind of taken as both kind of a historical telos in some ways and also as a kind of natural tandem where one exists, the other will come about. And that was essentially, that kind of, you could call it, let's say, the golden period of post-teleological thinking from 1989 to, I'll periodize it to 9/11, roughly. So that 12-year mark, during which history had ended, the kind of like great ideological conflicts were over, and human beings more or less had to kind of comfort themselves with kind of like basically what was again the mundane. That's not to say that the 1990s were this idyllic time, of course. Far from it, right? So just kind of off the top of my head, the genocide in Rwanda killed 600,000 people. The wars in Yugoslavia, very much a European conflict, no matter how you kind of carve it, killed 140,000 people. Palestine remained occupied. the USSR, the social crisis that came in the wake of the USSR's collapse affected all former territories and killed many, many people. And yet, even despite that, there's something about, I would say, kind of like the last 25 years in that kind of post 9/11 period that we can maybe consider as a kind of single growing pile of wreckage that only kind of appears more and more extreme the more time passes. So we can think of, I'm sure we can kind of get to a lot of the things in more detail during the course of our conversation, but the way that I kind of thought it might be helpful to think of the present conjuncture, the present moment, is by looking at a set of kind of overlapping nested crises, right? So ones that are unfolding in kind of separate domains, but nevertheless are starting to kind of cumulatively affect each other and spiral, right? So we have a kind of political crisis on the one hand, and everything that I'm saying here applies, of course, not just to the US, but I think to many what we call kind of advanced liberal capitalist democracies, right? So we have kind of like a breakdown of institutional mechanisms through which capitalist democracies previously had kind of been able to triangulate between mass preferences and the preferences of elites. The Cold War played a large role, I think, in actually compelling elites in the West to moderate their own preferences and actually to be open to some kind of modicum of a welfare state, even though they might have kind of kvetched and complained about it the whole time as well. But more than, now we no longer have that kind of mechanism of accountability, however imperfect that might have been, right? We also have a kind of fragmentation of the political sphere as such, right? We've all kind of like heard these arguments, but the breakup of kind of traditional forms of mass media, the breakup of, domains through which people could kind of have a sense that they were participating in a kind of common national understanding of what politics or the political was, is arguably starting to fragment as well. We also have essentially the systematic kind of deconstruction. This was very much a kind of top-down elite project of deconstructing mass channels for participation and for political voice, right? So if we think of traditional institutions, things like public education, like labor unions, like religious institutions, all of those things that kind of in some ways defined the post-war consensus, even really up through the 1980s, have become, I think, irreparably frayed at this point. So that's the political. We also have an ideological crisis. So I mentioned a moment ago that the assumption of the 1990s was that democracy and markets would go hand in hand, right? That where markets exist, they essentially introduce some form of representative democracy, however belated that might be. I think that kind of thinking is no longer the case, right? It's very much clear that like those two things have become decoupled and markets have won, at least in the preferences of the people whose opinions and decisions and power matters. At the same time, democracy has also kind of given way to no longer being the default ideology of people, right? I mean, we can talk more about why that's the case, but essentially this has given rise to both old new racialisms and new forms of ethnocentrisms, new visions of community that are much more exclusive rather than inclusive. It's a struggle over what universality really means in the present. And right now the scale is very much on the side of exclusivity rather than universality. This is all just kind of coupled also with a kind of legitimation crisis of the state. And if the state can no longer kind of justify what it's doing, it's going to increasingly turn to repressive measures to preserve order. And that's what's been happening. So that's the ideological kind of component of that. There's also a social reproductive crisis. When we think of what we call neoliberalism, the neoliberal mode of accumulation, however you might want, or regime of accumulation, however you might want to kind of, periodize that moment from the late 1970s up through roughly 2008, we can think of a gradual kind of decoupling of social reproduction from public and state services, meaning that the privatization of larger and larger spheres of activity that were necessary for the reproduction of, labor force, forms of life, ways in which society actually kind of creates the conditions for its own reproduction. So gradually the shift of cost of social reproduction, the cost of social reproduction was shifted onto the working class, right? So this came with kind of increasing levels of personal indebtedness, of crises of housing, of care, of all of the things that were at that point, previously still somewhat covered by imperfect, but still kind of notable social safety net. This became kind of all the more prominent, I think, in 2020 during the pandemic, when essentially what the pandemic did was kind of normalize a lot of things that were already kind of happening under the surface, but essentially by normalizing death and disposability as a kind of fact of life, it again kind of created a new calculus of what society could look like coming out of like a once in a century pandemic. And finally, we have what I think of as of course, the ecological crisis, of which I'm sure my co-panelists have a lot to say as well. Essentially, the destruction of all forms of life as such, but also perhaps creating, perhaps opening kind of like the possibility of a future in which there's this kind of negative, vicious cycle of destruction and mass displacement that is at the same time also kind of like facilitates new attempts at capital accumulation over what is actually kind of like a very shrinking and much more precarious set of like living conditions for everybody involved, right? And we can think about what attempts those are. But just because cities are sinking and just because ecological niches are being destroyed does not mean that capital is not going to try to sell us some new way of kind of innovating out of that crisis, or potentially adjusting to the new normal, right? So crises are always also moments of opportunity for the powerful, for elites to actually kind of create a new normal, to create an understanding that actually this is the way things are going to be now. So when we think of kind of the present conjuncture, just to kind of wrap up, again, thinking of, what is the balance of social forces in a given moment, and how do we kind of try to make sense of everything that's happened? I think, we're always searching for parallels. I mean, even if we just kind of think of the parallels that have been discussed over the last 5 years, right? I just mentioned one, the end of the USSR, right? And some people say this is kind of like the long, protracted decline of an empire, right? Where it's not going to be this one single break, but it is going to be a kind of gradual, messy, kind of like tapering off. People also talk about the 1970s as being kind of like another potential analogy. People talk about the Gilded Age. People talk about the 1920s or the 1930s, right? Of course, periodization and parallels are always going to be imperfect. But that doesn't mean that they don't have kind of like something to tell us. I think the one that that kind of stuck out in my mind the most recently, this was something that I had seen somebody kind of make a comment about this, is comparing this to the 1920s. Coming out of the destruction of World War I. But in a way, if a lot of what happened politically in the 1920s was a reactionary response to the prospects of a global communist revolution, which scared the hell out of elites all over the world, maybe the 2020s are actually kind of more darker in some ways, because what we have is the kind of unraveling of what is now a morally and ideologically and intellectually bankrupt form of liberalism that kind of came to a head with the Pax Americana project. But now there's no emancipatory promise on the horizon, or at least not one that's kind of immediate to me as to what those prospects are. If, folks want to point out things that we could kind of use to hold out hope, I'm very happy to hear that. But sometimes again, it's having to go through the kind of dark moments to really try to understand where we are and get our bearings before we can even begin to see what might come to replace them. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Sophie, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah. It's really nice that the room is so full and that there's so much love for BISR here. And thank you for listening to a panel on the conjuncture during this lovely summer evening. Don't let us be up here for longer than past 8:30. I find the sort of so what is up kind of prompt very sort of stultifying and panicking. So I'm going to try and edge my way into answering conversationally, which was the deal. And I've been sort of talking about anti-fascism one way or another in lots of full rooms for several months now, under the sort of aegis of talking about specifically anti-fascist feminism and feminist anti-fascism, with the understanding that we're in a moment in history when fascism is actually once again, speaking of the 1920s, one of feminism's forms of appearance. And that's kind of something that we see not only in the sort of packaging of anti-Palestinian genocide as feminist, but also in the sort of packaging of anti-trans annihilationism as somehow a question of sex-based rights or women's security, right? And, I am a sort of symptom of our times in and of myself because I have leaned out of formal academia now for the past, I fell out essentially about a decade ago, and BISR is one of the sort of webs that caught me. I'm an independent scholar / writer. I sometimes call myself an ex-academic. Being in online spaces, teaching courses on care communization, abolition of the family, in other words, on the work of Firestone, on the work of Kathy Weeks, on children's liberationism, this other sort of erased and buried horizon of leftist struggle, on enemy feminisms like femo-nationalism and turfism, and learning with people in this room how to sort of concretize these topics for anti-fascist practice and purposes in community has been one of the real, it really has been one of the richest elements of my life. I'm very grateful to BISR for sort of channeling and bringing people together in those forums. And I think it's difficult to strike the right tone given the seriousness and the sort of vertiginousness, right, of the stakes of this moment. We've referred to the original Institute for Social Research and what it was for and what it was against, right? And this is a time. The debates around whether or not it is fascism yet seem to me rather irrelevant to the imperative that I think we all agree on, that anti-fascism is all we should all we should be discussing on some level, right? At least we can agree on the anti-fascism part, given the fascisizing dynamics of pretty much everything in our society. A more specific way of perhaps putting this, to which I can then add some of my actual expertise and research, which is, as I mentioned, the abolition of the family politics that I understand to be feminism's undercommons or real purpose. I've written a book called Full Surrogacy Now, articulating that, and a clarificatory sort of pamphlet, Abolish the Family, after that. And then I sort of turned to the dark side, the sort of enemy feminisms or feminisms of fools that have, often counter-revolutionarily, but feministly, suppressed the kind of revolutionary energies of proletarian feminisms from below. But what we can say here, I think, is that we're experiencing in our moment a pretty uncanny spasm of neo-nationalism, right? Nationalism of various kinds. So this includes what Richard Seymour would call disaster nationalism, which has a lot to do with conspiracism, these sorts of diagonalist, as it's also possible to call it, formations that invite us to, strike out at a phantasmatic enemy of the folk or the ethnos in order to sort of attempt to shore up a form that in many ways capitalism has abandoned, right? There's like no national container for capital anymore at this point. But then there's also porno-nationalisms, right? Formations that, are predicated on fantasies that are quite lurid and, outlandish and difficult to believe anyone genuinely sort of believes, but nonetheless work, about, baby blood drinking, child trafficking, reptilian pedophile traffickers, right? And this really recapitulates, it's why it's quite useful to look at a 200-year sweep of what I call enemy feminists. This really recapitulates in an uncanny way the dynamics, the counter-revolutionary dynamics internal to organized womanhood of the late 19th century and early 20th, as in white slavery, right? Which was a sort of distortion to, securitizing pro-state ends of what originally represented a sort of anti-state mobilization against the state as pimp, and turned into something whose energies were directed very much not at the state, not at the medical establishment, not at, in fact, everyday patriarchy, but at the phantasmatic and often racialized sexual predatory white slaver, right? The slaver of, putative slaver trafficking white girls, which historians really agree was pretty much entirely made up, right? Just as Pizzagate, not a thing. So nationalism is also something I very much hope the left, articulates more strongly its kind of utter disdain for in this moment. We are also in a moment of cultural conservatism, I would say, which penetrates the left too, right? This kind of, I'm seeing revivals of Christopher Lash, and there's this sort of anti-utopianism on the left that is, supposedly the realistic response to a moment of, fascist triumph. And this could also, of course, as we know, result in, trans liberation being sacrificed or thrown under the bus in this moment, which would be the worst possible thing to do. Nationalism is something I really think we should discuss seriously as inherent to, for example, the feminism represented by J.K. Rowling, right? So a sexual nationalism. This is someone who quotes Andrea Dworkin historically, describes herself as a radical feminist, and applauds Donald J. Trump's executive order, defending women against gender ideology extremism. Some of us, unhappily, have been Cassandras, foretelling the importing of TERF Island to the United States and elsewhere for about, 13 years or so. And here we are, there is a nationalism of sex that is once again being sort of, offered to a feminist population or a potentially activatable feminist population that is rightly, and this is what's so dangerous and so reminiscent of the 1920s, disgusted, with the options that have been on offer, right? Like Kamala, or I don't know, what's the sort of other option? Like, I suppose the trad movement has a certain eros to it, right? The trad wife thing. Quite seriously, it's a dangerous fucking place to be. The people who are talking about care, most prominently are actually neo-reactionaries, right? There's a strand of politics right now that actually describes itself as reactionary feminism. So one of the prime reactionary feminists who gets a lot of Heritage Foundation money is called Mary Harrington. She's written a book called Feminism Against Progress. And, you know, she teams up with people like Louise Perry, who has a book about the against the sexual revolution, which is the feminist case for not having divorce as an option, and so on and so forth. And there's also, I could list more names. You know, Erica Bakayocki is a self-described radical fundamentalist, Wollstonecraftian. You know, so Mary Wollstonecraft, who helped put the final nail in the coffin of Roe versus Wade, right? Because abortion is the last thing that women want as feminists. So these people are there presenting an actually quite dangerously convincing case against liberal feminism. And what they frame this as is like team freedom. They mean Judith Butler, who they obviously misread, but you know, this is the point here is that we have ceded the ground as left feminists, unfortunately, to these ghouls to occupy the position of team care. Right? And so this is why I really want there to be conversations, as I say, about antagonisms internal to feminism, right? You know, sorry, just to plug my goddamn book, right? This is what I'm thinking about all the time. We need an erotics of anti-fascist feminism because, you know, it is disarming and demobilizing and therefore quite a dangerous position to be in anti-fascist terms, to be confused about whether or not X, Y, and Z black shirts or quasi-black shirts of our time are feminist or not. Who cares, right? On some level, if it doesn't matter to you, perfect, go right ahead. But if it gives you pause, you know, that someone is a feminist before you build your barricade against them or punch them in the face, then consider that there is an antagonism internal to this historical category and this legacy that has mutant strands intertwined within it of liberalism and fascism, and which means that we have to actually be comfortable understanding that feminism is capacious enough to contain within itself its own enemies, that there are two wolves within feminist history, historically, and that, you know, and that there is genuinely a team care communization, but that the opposite team is actually a team of sort of porno-nationalistic, securitizing, governance womanhood. And this is what Emma Heaney calls cisness, you know, and it is something that brutalizes us all, right? This category, cisness, that ontologizes sex, naturalizes assigned sex in a hierarchized ontology, that all of us really need to be, talking about as not a minority issue, not an identity politics issue, but as one of the main, vectors of the contemporary class war. Okay.
Thank you so much. Where are my notes? Oh, there they are. Going last here was maybe a bad choice. Okay. I spoke a lot at the beginning, so I won't speak as much now, so we can do some crosstalk and some closing remarks as well. And then get back to drinking. But I figured, similarly to Raf, some sort of historical grounding is important, although I didn't, that was a lot you covered there. That was great. But when we were sort of doing prep, we talked a little bit about thinking about the sort of sweep from the beginning of the pandemic to now. And I think the place I want to start is what are the continuities and the breaks between the different political regimes that have been in the U.S. since then, right? So we're principally talking about the end of Trump 1, Biden 1, and now Trump 2. And I don't want to underplay the current moment, but there are a lot of continuities that are pretty ugly. So the first one that I will mention well, actually, since I just did, in fact, talk about COVID, I mean, one of the big, talking about the sort of normalization of mass death, of annihilationist impulses, I mean, one of the biggest sort of moments for that was actually during the Biden administration when they chose to just stop counting. It was like, oh, COVID's over, y'all. It's funny, I don't wear a mask, but I have long COVID and all that bad stuff. Like, it didn't go anywhere. And as someone who spends a lot of time studying ecology, also like pandemics, these kinds of like once a century pandemics are now going to be like every couple of years. Maybe not that much, but pretty fast. The deportation regimes, immigration detention, the U.S. runs, everyone knows this, but I'll just say it, right? The world's largest. This is crazy because this is actually pure numbers, not even per capita. So like, for example, China, right, billion people, much smaller prison detention system than the United States. But yes, the U.S. Deported under, actually going back to Obama, but under Biden, just a huge number of people. Now, Trump is ramping that up in ways that are genuinely, do seem to be like a qualitative shift, but in, I think, two ways that are perhaps unexpected. One is really a challenge at talking about crisis of liberalism, liberal democracy, et cetera, is that a lot of the cases are being adjudicated outside questions of the rule of law. They're being adjudicated on like, is this a desirable person? Should this person be around? As someone who's studied a lot of historical fascism, like this is fascist legal theory, like in a nutshell. Like this is. Oh, sorry. The second one is great power conflict with China, which I'm going to come back many times. Very famously, people probably maybe don't, but yeah, people all remember, when the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually is a very shitty climate bill, people who say it's a good one are idiots, passed, climate was mentioned like 3 times, I believe, in the cover summary, and like beating China was mentioned like 800 times. And I'll come back to this several times because right now is a vital window that if there is not U.S.-China geopolitical partnership on things like climate in particular, we are in a very bad situation. The next continuity I thought I would mention, although there's many others, is of course, again, the Palestine question. And just as with and here I'll tie it also to immigration. The main differences here, in addition to the legal ones I just mentioned, are actually kind of aesthetic, or spectacle, right? Which is not immaterial or like a sideshow, right? So there has been large continuity in American policy towards Palestine between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. But of course, the Trump administration produces those like comically hilarious, like weirdo, like Gaza Riviera videos and stuff like this. I'll probably come back to this later, but please go home and look up the Pete Hegseth video on Greenland, which looks like the introduction to a Call of Duty video game. But this kind of stuff is actually like real, and I actually think is really important to the question of fascism, because actually like a lot of that like online sort of like Greco-Roman neoclassical return stuff isn't really quite the aesthetics of fascism in this moment. And then, so what are the breaks? So one of the most obvious breaks, I already hit it, is that, and this is actually quite interesting because Trump 1 didn't actually pull this off. Trump 2, they are really pushing as far as they can into the sort of classic sort of Schmittian ideals of a unitary executive, or the president or the executive as the guarantor of the law, not subject to the law. This is quite alarming, to say the least. The Trump tariff, I'm doing sort of bullet points just to go fast. The Trump tariff regime, which can just seem insane, and it is partially insane, like the world's basically still global hegemon trying to do import substitution like they're like a developing country is extremely bizarre. But you can see where it plays ideologically into a kind of like sort of revitalized, jingoistic, let's call it a new form of nationalism, let's call it a new form of fascism, whatever terminology you like. It plays into that ideologically, but also this is part of an attempt, I think, to really sort of take or desperately hold on to the centrality of the United States to the global economy. Ironically, it's backfiring in many ways because there's a greater, but not like over 50% chance, but much greater than before, of a switch in reserve-backed currencies, for example, and things of this nature. I don't know if this is too in the weeds for this kind of talk, but I hope not. And also, the other thing that people sort of missed in the sort of tariffs back and forth is that this was also a way of forcing other markets. So two of my favorite examples on this are Japan and the EU, to accept American, basically to universalize American regulatory standards globally. Because if you have like local regulatory standards saying like, oh, my rice actually can't have plastic in it, like you can't then buy them. That's counted as a trade barrier. On climate, oh God, on climate, it's very, very funny. I'll reference my own work. I've called this right-wing climate realism in the past, right? Out of the sort of spokespeople, right? They're like, we don't believe in this bullshit. It's a conspiracy, whatever, volcanoes, China, whatever it is, it's not happening. But again, just one level below that, literally cabinet secretary level, and then certainly when you get into like both the like weeds of the right-wing sort of intellectual space, but also of the sort of right-wing bureaucratic space, it's taken very seriously. And there is an interesting shift, and this is actually very difficult to understand, and I hope this is the kind of conversations that people can continue, whether at home or later tonight. This is a real shift in American imperialism from what was kind of almost like a networked model, right? Very famous, the United States has the most military base in the world. They cover basically everything. But Trump really has this kind of like 19th century view of American empire and really is into things like the Monroe Doctrine. Again, the Greenland stuff is very serious, and it is couched in the official White House sort of releases, videos, memos, and stuff as a climate issue, just not using any of the buzzwords they don't like. It's couched as, as the ice caps melt, because we know they will. We're not saying why that's happening, but we know they will. We, again, must beat China. We must beat Russia in the land grab, right? So this sort of land grab version of imperialism is actually, in many ways, like a bizarrely, talk about the Gilded Age. It's really like, it doesn't actually line up with classic fascism. And there are so many things I could talk about, but I don't want to do them all. So I'll limit to just two more things, and then we'll get to, I think, we'll get to crosstalk where hopefully good things come out, and then we'll finish. The last thing I'll say about climate, though, that is actually a piece of good news, again, centered around China, is that Chinese emissions peak this year. I'm proud to say I predicted this. This is important because unlike many European countries, unlike us, the Chinese actually make things, and that is where most pollution comes from, production, and most greenhouse gas emissions. Will this actually work? Is this temporary? Is this some kind of slowdown? We'll have to see. You really need like 2 to 3 years to measure these things. But turning to the question that both Raf and Sophie have raised as like this, like the new fascism is weird. I have to say. And I say this as someone who's been very vocal about supporting the fascism thesis. I find many of the other people who support the fascism thesis to be a little bit comical. Timothy Snyder and who else? Jason Stanley, like, fled to Canada. Like, Like, we just talked about the OG institutions. They were all like hit lists. They were Jewish Marxist communists, like under fucking Hitler. Like, they were gonna get killed. No one's coming after Tim Snyder. If there's a Walter Benjamin in the world right now,
until they take
like,
Canada.
it's like it's a Palestinian literary critic like reviewing books on the backs of envelope while looking for flour. But in any case, a couple of parallels I think are important here are I don't think we should just think of Trump as the principal example of neo-fascism in this moment. He is sort of our variation on the tomb, but he is very important because of the role the U.S. plays in the world. And I will say, and this is somewhat controversial, I would view the displacement of the U.S. as the global hegemon as an unmitigated good. Bad things could happen. I'm not saying other challengers are great people, but if you look at the rule of American empire, even compared to British empire, it's kind of pretty shit. But neo-fascism actually seems to be far more stable than original fascism. I credit this to the acceptance of basically allowing empty suit challenger parties. So it's like there's like nominal functional democracy, and contemporary liberalism has basically been reduced to that. It's like, oh, if I get to vote on it still, then I have democracy. I don't think any of these things are democracies anymore. But the two models I often turn to, and I swear this is not because of my identity, are India, which is the closest to the classic model. So the movements that people like Narendra Modi come from are traced back to the 1920s. They are openly fascist movements. Hindutva is an openly ultranationalist fascist program. It's been in power for, God, over a decade now. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere, but they still have competitive elections and all that jazz. And this will, I think, this is a sad point to raise for many on the left. There have been things like mass general strikes. Unionization in a place like India is massive, and it had no political effect. Modi remains as strong as ever and is enforced, and I see Trump doing this with things like ICE by both sort of the official police forces, then sort of semi-official, and then straight up street thugs. Right, sort of roaming the streets. The other model is, of course, and I hate to keep coming back to this, but I must, is Israel. Every time one of these far-right leaders appears on the global stage, they sort of make this obsequious, weird journey to Jerusalem, where they sort of are like, let's join the Fascist International, but we're not like the old ones. We're the new ones. And someone like Netanyahu, of course, is like, yeah, we love you. There are Israeli political theorists, I don't think Susie's here tonight, but she's written a lot about this, who are some of the key, so I think people know of folks like Curtis Yarvin just had that huge profile in The New Yorker, or Nick Land, maybe some of these other neo-reactionary thinkers. You introduced me to a few just now I never heard of in the sort of feminism reactionary space. But Israel has been pumping out sort of like airport book political theory fascism. The most famous is, oh God, it's Hariri, right? The Virtue of Nationalism. He's the one who coined the term ethnocracy, which is just a way of basically saying fascism, but you get some rights in the thing. And his argument is exactly as Sophie described. It starts at the family. The family is the natural unit. Of course, we all know historically, like the idea of the modern family is extremely recent, et cetera, et cetera. But right, as the family, then the tribe, then the nation. And that this is a sort of a natural affinity group. And it's very funny, like a lot of classical right-wing thinkers from Burke to Schmidt, well, Burke is before Marx, but whatever. It's like anything left of center. So Schmidt's a really good example. He's like, liberalism, Marxism, I don't care. These things both could actually work, and we must destroy them. But to both Sophie and Raf's point, a lot of times this is tilting at phantasmic enemies. The closest thing to a genuine challenger is is People's Republic of China, and they seem very little interested. I mean, they're interested in power, don't get me wrong, they're very interested in all kinds of things, but they don't actually seem to want to, like, conquer the United States or Europe. Like, they're actually not a particularly belligerent power. So understanding neo-fascism in this moment and how we respond to it is A, vital, B, just because I think it's very easy to get caught in, like, the sort of hype cycles and news cycles and things like this. Historically, in almost every case, again, you could do the Nazis, but you can also do Salazar, you can also do Franco, you can also do, Chile, Pinochet.
Yeah.
The weird thing about conservative revolution versus, like, say, classical, like, communist revolution, like the Bolsheviks, something like this, is that actually it doesn't turn society upside down. It's actually like a slow wrangling, right? It's conservative. It's literally meant to preserve existing social and enhance existing social hierarchies. So often, like, day-to-day life continues. There's wrangling. It's not the all-powerful Hollywood version. It's this kind of handshake deal in which you dissolve a lot of the guardrails, and instead, again, replace this with sort of the pure expression of power. And I think on that, well, and okay, this is the actual last thing I'll say, which is maybe a ray of hope. I hate doing this Disney happy ending bullshit. But, you know, it's two things. I'm old enough, I'm a middle-aged Marxist. I am a Gen X Marxist. So I'm old enough
So long as you're not an ex-Marxist.
No, never. Everyone at Columbia thought I was like a fossil from the 19th century. No, but so there was this old kind of dippy slogan, but it is important, I think, in a moment like this, especially when we have to acknowledge the left is quite weak, which is that the global, right? Think local. Think global, act local. And right here in New York, and I say this not as a J executive director, IRS, this is me as a J citizen. The work being done, again, I'm focused very much on climate, the work being done by Public Power in New York, for example, to push the governor to actually enforce the laws that have been passed to make New York State a more clean energy-driven economy, is very important, and I hope that Zoltan Mamdani is able to become our next mayor, as opposed to the murderous sex pest I started talking about at the beginning. So I'm going to stop my, like, bullety comments there. There's so much I could say. There's a proliferation of right-wing wars across the world. This itself should be talked about, going back to the global war on terror. But actually, I want to sort of shift to a couple questions. And before I do any of my prep ones, I just want to see if you guys have anything you wanted to ask each other about what you said. Oh, okay. So so something that I thought about. Oh, Sophie, do you have one? No. While Sophie was talking, but I think this is very resonant for you as well, and I'll sort of shut up about it. Is like, I love this idea of, like, anti-fascism as the, like, baseline. Like, we should all have this. I wonder how broadly, I think that is like 90% of actually existing leftists, in particular Marxists, I think agree on this. But I think some don't. And so that's something I am sort of curious to probe a little bit, as well as the sort of attraction, and again, this happened in both of your talks. It was actually one of my points that I just was like, oh, we don't have to hit that one. This sort of attractiveness of including amongst thinkers who self-identify as leftists, of traditional patriarchal family models as economically stable, as at least better than liberalism, neoliberalism, so on and so forth. So yeah, anti-fascism, the family. Let's go.
I can speak a little bit just about one part of that, which is the anti-fascism part. But the way in which anti-fascist discourse has actually been appropriated by liberals in a way to, frame the very, I think, fascist Trump regime in power, but in a way that actually, I think, removed a lot of like the really important like anti-fascist content out of it, right? So, I mean, let's just kind of think of how the last kind of like 8-10 years of resistance liberalism, what a giant missed opportunity that was to actually build the kind of like networks of like collective power and institutions of like
I
collective
really thought it
solidarity
would be possible.
that, well,
And
but
then it wasn't.
yeah, but I mean, just in the sense that could be kind of like a missed opportunity in that light. But at the same time, there's been almost this kind of like cosplaying of like popular frontism, like we are back in the 1930s, and like liberals and the left,
No Soviet Union.
the liberals and the left need to actually band together to stop, the right from coming into power, but on terms that are dictated almost entirely by kind of like liberalism, right, and by kind of like just things being the way that they are. So I mean, let's just kind of like think of, and this kind of connects to a point that I wanted to make when I was speaking earlier about democracy, just the kind of like exhaustion of like liberal ideas.
This is good.
And you can just like see it in the if you think back to kind of like some of the recent campaign slogans from like during the presidential election, like love Trump's hate from Clinton back in 2016. And then from Kamala, it's, we are not going back, or we need to just kind of defend democracy. But like really over the last decade or so, the language of like defending democracy has gotten entirely kind of emptied of any substantive content at that point, right? I mean, like democracy has always been a floating signifier. It's always been a kind of concept that has, its function in modern political discourse has always been a site of contestation, and it has been up to kind of social movements to actually, make claims for expanding what counts as democracy within any kind of given moment, right? But here, it's almost like we've had this kind of reverse shrinking effect where we're gonna actually kind of like narrow and circumscribe the language of democracy to basically kind of mean establishment liberalism or like the Democratic Party, right? So just kind of like think of like the way that this kind of functioned in the last election. This basically meant by 2024 that like defending democracy meant smuggling in everyone into this kind of like simulacra of like a popular front, from Bush era war criminals, right, to like suburban moms and just like wealthy suburbanites, to DSA, right, and like somehow pretend that this is a viable coalition that is actually going to stand up for something like America, everything that is not Trumpism, that is not the right? And no big surprise, but that fell short. So essentially, I'll probably just leave it at that and turn it over to Sophie about this.
Yeah, I would say, liberal anti-fascism is a bit of an oxymoron. The fact that Timothy Snyder says that it's liberal, that it's fascism, doesn't mean that it isn't actually. But we're seeing there's a riot in LA against ICE happening, right? There is, something clarifying about the last 5 years, I would optimistically say, that has shown people that, there's no justice, there's just us. I mean, the demonstration that, the two parties are equally pretty much committed to genocides of various kinds, has had some popular uptake. I would optimistically say, right? There's a, there are good news. People do hate the police. That people do hate ICE. People do hate eugenics. People do hate, arbitrary, militarized state power. And they do hate settler colonial Lebensraum. Like Gaza did actually contribute to, the loss of, the COP candidate in the last election, who I obviously hope I wish very much we were fighting right now. But, the COP versus the felon framing was absolutely disastrous alongside joyful genocide, right? Feminist genocide. But I mean, this is no time for incrementalism. I think this is a time for, doubling down, insisting on the recognition that has, cracked open so visibly that it's very much, not so much socialism or barbarism as like communism or fascism, I think. I mean, there is, a need right now. I'm seeing in the revival on the left of various kinds of conservatism, and I would include in that the kind of sex separatist or cultural feminist or sex nationalist, as I'm suggesting we call it, in the sense that there's an appeal to, stopping the boats against the refugees of gender, or, shoring up the walls, strengthening the borders of a certain kind of ontologized womanhood. I think that I'm suggesting that's nationalism. There's something in the conservatism around the family as well. This weird kind of retort you get from people who are like, isn't capitalism abolishing the family? So Christopher Lasch, I opened up, I think it's in Haven in a Heartless World. What I find so fascinating is that he's actually he's clear-eyed enough. Andrea Dworkin is also clear-eyed enough about Zionism to say, yeah, I get that it's very bad, but actually I want it anyway. Christopher Lasch says, actually the feminist movement is completely right about the family. It's just that, what are you going to do? Like, there's a
How many legions does the feminist movement have?
Yeah, there's actually there's a moment I found really quite like astonishing where he's like, yeah, but children need women to sacrifice themselves in this way. And there's a foreclosure of the imagination that things could ever be different. And simultaneously, the good news is that I'm seeing more and more again citations or appeals to a kind of mothering against motherhood, care communizational horizon. And I'll just mention two forms of this. Emma Heaney's work about the way that the genocide of children that is the acceleration of the 77-year-long Nakba, right, since October 7th. Genocide of children has really helped refine and, clarify for her the stakes of what James Baldwin said is the fundamental sort of revolutionary insight that the children are always all of ours, right, that the children belong to all of us. And this thought has just been ricocheting around. In a book by Amber Hussein that is forthcoming, that I've just been sent, she cites a version of this by Diane di Prima. Diane di Prima, in the same kind of Baldwinian mode, saying there is no orphan on earth who is not your child, right? And this kind of sensibility is the opposite, right? It's the dialectical response to the Laschian insistence that all the left can ever do is capitulate to the privatization of care. I think we've run out of time, pretty much.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we are running up on time. So I think I'll just ask one more question, and then if people have final thoughts to share, go for it. I realize I skipped my Columbia joke, so I'll slip
Free
that in at the end.
sex-affirming care, by which I mean abortion as well, on demand for all, without apology.
Thank you. Wait, should I not ask the question?
Oh, I thought that was the question.
Oh, no. The question actually was one.
But you said final thoughts.
Oh, no,
Let's
I
go
said
have a drink.
I'll ask one more and then we'll do final thoughts. But that was a really good final thought. Well, we can count it. No, because one of the things I noticed that is across all of our talks, but in particular yours, both of yours, is sort of how we understand different forms of nationalism. Because of course, and this is always something I struggle with, because I think it's Hobsbawm, the old Hobsbawm essay, right? That it's all kind of bullshit, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, national liberation has been a progressive force, has been a vital force in especially decolonization and other moments. And I often wonder how, well, there's relatively simple ways, I think, to distinguish these things, but there's also shared pathologies sometimes, and even people like Fanon wrote about this quite a lot. But I'm wondering how you think in this moment, or how we are thinking in this moment, about sort of emergent nationalisms that are not necessarily automatically right-wing, coming especially from the global south, versus the kind of like hyper new jingoism. It's not even that new, but it's just more open of a place like the United States, especially under Trump.
I'm not a big fan of nationalism.
I mean, I said that too. Yeah.
You know, I think that, like with any kind of like political formation, the nation state itself is a transient kind of historical phenomenon that in the 19th and the 20th centuries gave forms to certain kinds of emancipatory movements that were, you know, articulated through nationalist discourse. But at the same time, those movements were also kind of composed of broad coalitions of not just working class people, but also of kind of local bourgeoisie, of local elites. And so we always kind of have to be, I think, mindful about who is kind of like articulating national claims, even under the language of anti-colonialism, to try to kind of like approach them sympathetically, but also critically at the same time. I'd like to just kind of also just add one thing, which I didn't get a chance to comment, which was has to do with what Ajay said about continuities and breaks with relation to Trump. I think we need to like absolutely think of like the post 9/11 security state as like fundamentally the locus around which that continuity and break has taken place, right? If when we think of kind of like what's like the Venn diagram in American politics between the right and the center, and that's always just been for the last 20 years or so, 25 years, the national security state,
Yes.
right? Liberals spent decades kind of building up this massive state apparatus, probably the most developed state apparatus ever known to human history, under the kind of like premise that basically this would be handled by the responsible adults in the room, that this would be something that would require kind of like certain technocratic competence that was at the heart of American stewardship of like the post-war global world, and which would continue through the 1990s and kind of like, you know, into the 21st century. What's happened now, which is I think what makes this moment incredibly dangerous, is actually that same apparatus has now kind of become grafted onto a right-wing fascist, previously marginal movement that over the last 30 years or so has kind of colonized one of the two major political parties in our political system. And this is kind of like where the pathologies of our political system actually come in, because had we had a proportional representation system, the modern day versions of the Republicans would be a kind of marginal far right party that might be necessary, you know, for coalitions. But because there was that kind of outlet was not possible institutionally, the only way for that movement to succeed was through this kind of colonization internal to the party structure as such, right? So what we have here is this kind of bipartisan state apparatus that has now fallen in the hands of a right wing that is now basically metastasized into a quasi-fascist political regime that is still kind of like unfolding, and there's a lot still to figure out what's going to happen. And I don't think that they're hegemonic yet. I think that there's a lot of internal contradictions yet. I think that there's a lot of potential for kind of like elite dissensus, but nevertheless, this is just kind of one of those very difficult moments that leads me to be very, very concerned about what's happening.
All right. So we are running up on time. So I want to say thank you to all of you for listening to this. I hope you feel a little more situated. Oh man, I didn't get to tell my joke about Colombia, but I'll just say BISR is more than happy to take on the heavy burden of Colombia's assets, since they are clearly incapable of governing themselves. And on that note, please enjoy your dinners, your drinks, and the rest of your night.
BISR's Morningside campus, Morningside Heights campus.